Well, hey everybody, welcome to the Chicago Burlington and Quincy Railroad and the Chicago and Northwestern Railway in Wyoming. I'm Mark Pruitt, Thermopolis ticket agent. Today is October 3rd, 2023, and this is layout update number 47. You know, it's getting more and more difficult to think up jobs for the railroad that I haven't already said. So if anybody has any ideas, any suggestions or anything, please leave them in the comments below. Thanks. I worked on several different areas of the layout since the last update, including installing backdrop supports for Thermopolis, extension of the lead to west staging, an attempt to add the dirt in the Powder River stock pens that became something of a calamity, progress on the Wind River Canyon, installation of the Douglas subroadbed and roadbed, and the addition of more rolling stock to the layout. Let's start with Thermopolis. Other than sitting a few structures in place, Thermopolis hasn't changed much since I finished the track work in early 2022, more than 18 months ago. Almost on a whim, on the 5th of September I decided it was time to put in the support posts for the backdrop. First thing I discovered was that my usual advanced planning was as effective as always. Track bus wiring I installed in November of 2021 would have to be rerouted. It ran right where I needed to install the support posts. The green wire would have to be relocated. That was actually easier than I thought it would be. I drilled a dozen new holes in the joists and shifted the wire further under Wind River Canyon. Total work time was less than an hour. With the wiring issue resolved, I turned my attention to the baseboard at the west end of Thermopolis. To make room for the supports, I needed to trim it a bit. A Bosch jigsaw made short work of this task. Installing the supports was more difficult than the prep work had been. I wanted the supports to be in a nice straight line with curves at each end of Thermopolis. I also wanted a uniform height. To accomplish these goals, I clamped my 6-foot ruler to the baseboard after the first two supports were in place and pushed all the supports in between against that. Height was easy. I clamped my 7-foot level to the top of the installed posts and simply butted the in-between supports against the bottom of the level. What made the installation so hard to do was that I had to crawl under the Wind River side of the peninsula to clamp each support in place, then get up and walk around to the Thermopolis side to check the position. This involved checking that the post was vertical, which of course they weren't, then pushing the top back until they were. That moved the post slightly away from the ruler clamped to the baseboard, so I'd have to go back under the Wind River side of the benchwork to reposition the bottom of the post slightly. I wound up running back and forth 3 or 4 times for most posts, and half a dozen times or even more for a few of them. I ran back and forth probably almost 3 miles just around the end of that peninsula. Oh, and if the post started out tilted a little too far back, I had to crawl back under the benchwork to reposition the bottom of the support before I could even really begin to set it. Of the 18 total support posts, 10 or 11 had me running around the end of the peninsula. The rest, on the end wings, I could do just from the Thermopolis side. By the 8th, I completed the post installation. All that's left to do now is install a top rail, then tack up the styrene skyboard, which I'll be picking up in Denver in a couple of days. The second job of the month was to extend the west staging lead to where the staging yard would start. I started this task the same day I started installing the Thermopolis backdrop supports. The first step was to install the curve that brings the line parallel to the Casper end wall. That part was pretty easy. I had to get a little bit creative in terms of supports for the track in this area. That horizontal piece is a short section of one of the L girders off the old New Jersey version of the layout. A few days later, a slightly different version of that support carried the subroadbed under Casper. Because it was going to be tight working under Casper, I built the final section of the west staging lead in the aisleway in front of Casper, then installed it after the track was laid. Once I had the new section under Casper, I had to match it to the existing subroadbed. Somewhat to my surprise, this was not hard at all. The free end of the section rested on plastic bins for a while as I moved things around under Casper to get the connection to the fixed end lined up properly. By the 14th, I had the lead connected and supported at the proper grade. It would have been really hard to lay track with the subroadbed already in position, so I'm really glad I installed it beforehand. But there was a lot more room under Casper than I thought there would be, and I was able to sit comfortably on a small step stool to install the supports and adjust the grade. With the new section in place, it was easy to install the few missing sections of cork roadbed. I connected the track on the 16th and ran a train backwards down the entire lead from Franny to test it out. It was good, no sign of any track irregularities. When I begin building the staging yard itself, I'll take the same approach as I did with the lead. I'll lay all the track, install the switch machines and occupancy detectors, and test the whole thing. Then I'll move each yard section under Casper and raise it into position. With any luck, the whole process should only be moderately painful. But I think I'm going to need some help with that. Dave? This next job was a near disaster. I tried to put dirt on the floor of the Powder River stock pens, and it did not go well. The pens had been sitting in place since late June. I decided it was high time to bring them closer to completion. First, I filled the gap between the edge of the stock pen's base and the fascia with paper towels soaked with diluted white glue. I didn't want to try to fill that whole gap with tile grout. Kind of as an aside, I also spent an hour or so installing the first section of a dilapidated barbed wire fence at the backdrop in that same general area. This is a Woodland Scenic product, and I have several more sections to install that will carry the fence past the stock pens. Back to the pens. I misted water onto the base, dusted on the tile grout, and misted on more water to set the grout. Probably way too much water. Half an hour or so later, I went back to the train room to see how it looked, and I found this. It's hard to see in this photo, but the base was beginning to twist and warp, and it was carrying the pens with it. I hoped things wouldn't get any worse, but after a couple more hours, the pens looked like they were built in a big bowl. I had no idea foam core would twist and warp like that when it got a little bit wet. The next day, I lifted the whole assembly off the layout and set it on the big, very flat library table. Here you can clearly see the warping of the base, and to top it off, many of the fence posts lifted off the base. I thought I might have to just take the pens completely off the foam core, but I decided to see if I could somehow salvage the whole thing first. To that end, I cut a masonite panel to the same size as the foam core and coated it with diluted Mod Podge to make the masonite a bit more water resistant. After allowing everything a couple of days to dry, I sprayed Super 77 adhesive onto the masonite and placed the pens, still on their foam core base, on top of it. I weighted it down and let it set for a couple of days to make sure the foam core was flat against the masonite and well stuck to it. On the 25th, I carried the pens back to the layout. I deepened the recess to account for the extra thickness of the masonite panel, then set the pens in place. There's still some repair work to do to the pens themselves, but I think in time everything will be okay. When I've worked up enough courage, I'll try this whole thing again. Now we come to the biggest project of the month, Wind River Canyon. During August, I installed fascia in the canyon and around the peninsula end, then added the foam base for scenery as far around the end of the peninsula as I could. On September 20th, I finally got around to trimming all that fascia using a rotozip cutting tool. Here's how the canyon side of the peninsula looked after the rough cut was finished. The next day, I used a Sureform tool to remove the masonite fuzz left by the rotozip and added pink foam between the fascia and the tracks. Then it was time to shape the foam. I started with tunnel 3 at the end of the area covered with plaster cloth. I did the tunnel itself and the foam between the fascia and the track. I used my hot wire foam cutter for the initial trimming. Once I had this first section trimmed, I went back and attacked the foam with the Sureform tool. This roughens up the surface so that the plaster cloth will stick to it. Following that, I went back to the hot wire cutter, forming the basic shapes of tunnel 2, the pink tunnel, and the mountains above the fascia at the end of the peninsula. Then it was back to the Sureform tool again. It sure leaves a mess, doesn't it? After vacuuming up all that foam debris, the canyon looks like this. It's ready for plaster cloth anytime now. Any volunteers? The foam chunks torn off by the Sureform tool go all over the place, including onto the C&W tracks and the Burlington tracks inside the canyon walls. To get in to clean those, I had to build an access hole in the benchwork inside the turnaround curves. It's convenient having that, but I hope I never have to use it to clear derailment on those tracks. The last major project for the month was installing the Douglas subroad bed. I started this on September 26th. The first step was to cut the plywood for the big 60-inch radius curve and assemble those pieces. That curve takes the main line around the 45-degree outside corner at Douglas. You'll see where it goes in a minute. Then I cut the remaining plywood. After that, I started installing the subroad bed, beginning at the Grable/Oren benchwork on the left in this photo. Casper is about 2 inches higher than Grable, so as I built the subroad bed through Douglas, I also set the grades. In this shot, I've clamped the subroad bed for that large mainline curve, which also carries the Douglas siding, in place on the straight section that goes out of frame to the left. You can see where I've also located the 30-inch radius curve that comes out of Casper. The long yellow ruler is in place so I can mark where to cut the curves back to fit the straight section in between. By the end of the day on the 28th, the subroad bed was basically complete. Next step was to cut and install the cork roadbed. By yesterday, the cork roadbed installation was finished. With installation of track on this section of the layout, which I'm planning to do over the next few days, the Burlington mainline will finally be complete. There was also more motive power acquired for the layout, and 8 more cars were added. First up is this express box car. It's an Athearn ready to run I got from Bill in Sheridan, along with all those passenger cars and the way cars I covered last month. I don't generally buy RTR, but these were included in the large assortment I got from him. This second express boxcar was also in the package. Both of these will look good right behind the tenders of some of the passenger trains. I also added 4 more reefers from various manufacturers. At least 3 of these were gifts from Dave in Canada. This one is an Athearn Blue Box kit. I think this reefer is an old train miniatures car, which is now sold as Walther's Mainline if I'm not mistaken. I'm not completely sure about the manufacturer though. I'm not sure who manufactured this one either, but I think it's another Athearn kit. Here's the final reefer. I don't know who manufactured it. I also added this old boxcar, the second LaBelle kit put together and finished by Bill and Sheridan. Like the other old boxcar I talked about last month, this car also is not suitable for interchange service anymore, so it will be restricted to running back and forth on the Casper to Lander line, usually carrying non-revenue railroad cargo like supplies for the Lander engine facilities and the station. The last new car for the month is this Virginian outside braced box. It's another of the cars Dave in Ontario sent me. I think this is an old Tyco car. Before weathering it, it was very plastic. With the addition of body-mounted couplers, which Dave did, good quality trucks, and weathering, this car is very serviceable, even if the side bracing does look a little bit over large. There was one addition to the motive power fleet this month. I bought this LMB Brass S2 Pacific for a very reasonable price. It's not in service yet because it needs some work to make it usable. I'll be remotoring the engine and adding a TCS wow sound decoder. Hopefully I'll have it prepped and in service in the next month or two. It will look great on the head end of the Nightcrawler. We're at the end of our monthly journey. My first order of business for October is completion of the mainline through Douglas. I should easily be able to have that done before the operating session on the 24th. I also am going to try to add a few temporary roundhouse tracks at Grable if I have the time. It will take me a few days to clean up the layout and prepare for the operating session. There's crap all over the layout from all the work I've been doing, and I'll need to run my track cleaning car over every bit of track. It will also take a few hours to set up the trains in JMRI for the session, plus several hours to verify they're all in their right starting places on the layout. Thanks for watching, everyone. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you next month.